High in the Himalayas, tensions turn deadly. 20 Indian soldiers are killed in a fight with Chinese troops. 1 week on, India's Prime Minister says their deaths will not go in vain. But who's to blame for this extraordinary escalation? I'm Ali Aslan, and today's newsmaker is the confrontation between India and China. For the first time in 45 years, troops have been killed along the border between India and China. But neither side fired a weapon. A brawl took place in the contested Himalayan territory last week, where dozens of soldiers were beaten to death. Both India and China blame the other for the violence. The nuclear neighbors insist they don't want war, but neither side is backing down. So, what could happen next? We'll discuss that in a moment. But first, Adam Platz has this report.
This is the funeral for one of the 20 Indian soldiers killed in fighting along the border with China on June the 15th. A 1996 agreement bans weapons or explosives in the disputed border areas, so not a single gunshot was fired. Instead, the two nuclear-armed states fought it out with sticks and stones and improvised weapons. The brawl took place high in the Kashmiri Himalayas Galwan Valley, along the poorly demarcated and heavily contested border known as the line of actual control.
चीन द्वारा एलएसी पर जो किया गया है, उससे पूरा देश आहत है, आक्रोशित है.
China has not disclosed its casualties, but Indian media has reported at least 40 Chinese deaths. Both sides blame the other for crossing into their territory and constructing military facilities and infrastructure near the border.
Indian troops seriously violated the bilateral consensus and crossed the borderline twice, engaging in illegal activities and provoking and attacking Chinese personnel, resulting in serious physical confrontation between border forces on the two sides.
Sometimes referred to as the world's highest conflict zone, the Kashmiri Himalayas are more often associated with Indo-Pakistani border disputes. But China and India also have a history of conflict along their more than 4,000-kilometer-long border. In 1962, China invaded the regions of Arunachal Pradesh and Aksai Chin. After 4 weeks of fighting and following US pressure, China withdrew from Arunachal Pradesh, but held on to Aksai Chin. The latter area has been a source of tensions ever since, but this is the first time that anybody has been killed in the border conflict for more than 40 years. The clashes have prompted protests in both countries, with Indians calling for a boycott of products from their largest trading partner. And China has since released footage of live-fire military operations in the Tibetan plains. But as the world's two most populous nations continue to grow their economies, does their future lie in cooperation or competition? And while both sides say they want peace on their frontiers, might Aksai Chin prove too contentious to resolve peacefully? Adam Platz, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now in New Delhi is retired Indian Army Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia. He's now the director of the Center for Joint Warfare Studies. In Beijing, we have China Affairs Analyst Einar Tangen. And Michael Kugelman joins us from Washington, D.C. He's the Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Vinod Bhatia, of course, this confrontation between the world's two most populous nations and nuclear powers has the international community quite concerned. And the blame game is on. Both sides accuse each other of crossing the border and provoking the fight. Who's actually to blame here? How did this all start?
If you put it in a context, the line of actual control is unfortunately neither defined nor delimited. It's a line of perceptions. And we have a 3,488 kilometers of land borders with China. And there has been a contest along the borders because it's not settled, so it has to be there. We have managed it very well till about the 15th of June, and it's been like I say, it's been the longest. It is the longest disputed border in the world, but the most peaceful. And the last shot in anger was fired in October of 1975. However, things have changed in the last few years. We've seen China's aggressive behavior out here. It started in 2013 in Dipsang, then 2014 in Chumar when President Xi Jinping was visiting India. It was the time when the visit was on. Unfortunate so. Then in 2017, China insisted on constructing a road in Doklam Plateau, which is part of Western Bhutan, but we have a treaty with Bhutan of 2007. And so this was going on. And while in 2020, India was trying to battle the pandemic, which is commonly believed to be a made in China coronavirus, we found that China had changed the status quo and had in multiple places in eastern Ladakh, that's the western sector, come across the perceived line of actual control and constructed quasi-permanent habitat and bunkers. That was...
Yeah. Let me jump in here, Einar Tangen. Clearly, Vinod Bhatia says in no uncertain terms that China is to blame for this incident. China provoked this incident. What is your take?
Well, the Chinese side looks at this in terms of a number of factors. One, there were very good relations after the Wuhan and Chennai visit. But thereafter, I think China was extremely surprised by what happened in Kashmir. And then there were some RSS senior leaders who stood in the Lok Sabha and said that they would not rest until they had taken back Pakistani Kashmir. And then there was the road building. The point of contention here, there's a road being built along there that will connect up a forward base and things like that. So the Chinese tend to take things very literally. And that coupled with kind of tensions as India was making overtures to the US, perhaps to be a doorstop to Chinese expansion, all of these things have kind of added up. And unfortunately, I think it's less about fault right now than it is about saving face for both sides. This is Asia. People are very conscious about people's dignity. And I think the correct way of looking at this is not whose fault it is. It's probably a little bit too much testosterone on behalf of military men, which of course is understandable. But at this point, I think cooler heads have to prevail. And I respect the general and his opinions about how this started. But the question is, how does it finish?
The question is not so much as to who started it, but how to finish it. Now, says Einar Tangen. Nevertheless, Michael Kugelman, there is curiosity out there in the world, of course, why this is happening. Who started it? What is your assessment?
Well, I echo what the last co-panelist said, that how it started is less important than how it ends, because it's a very tense situation right now. When you have a clash like you did last week that was so violent, where you have 20 Indian soldiers dead, we don't know about the fatalities on the Chinese side. That is an inherently escalatory action right there. So it's going to make it all the more harder to wind things down. And indeed, there had been a dialogue process that had begun earlier in June between Indian and Chinese military commanders. And that's what makes things particularly shocking, that even as that process was in place, you had that incredibly violent clash that set things back. In terms of your question, I do think if you look at the patterns of Chinese activities in recent years, and particularly recent months, we've seen increasingly assertive and muscular moves by China, including a number of provocations in the South China Sea, as well as some moves in Hong Kong, some bellicose rhetoric when it comes to Taiwan. And I think that Beijing has been arguably put on the defensive a bit, given that much of the world has been very critical of its initial handling of the coronavirus pandemic, and it likely felt the need to telegraph resolve and toughness. And I agree with what was said before, that India's move to revoke Article 370 of its constitution, which revoked the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir, I think that clearly could have been a motivating factor for China to engage in these provocations in Ladakh as well, given that the revocation of Article 370 impacted areas that China believes to be its own. So looking at that way, I do think that we have to look at China for being one of the main provocateurs. But indeed, as was noted before, India has been building roads on its side of the line of actual control for some time. One in particular, a very long one, which gives it access from Leh, the capital of Ladakh, all the way over near to the Karakoram Pass. That better allows India to project power in Ladakh, and that could certainly be considered provocative by China. So, how you answer the question, of course, depends on where you stand, where you sit.
Vinod Bhatia, putting the question as to who's actually responsible aside here for a second, this is the first fatal clash in the Ladakh Valley since 1975. Why is this escalating now? Why is this incident now blowing up?
I tend to agree with my panelists again. The aim should be to de-escalate. Disengagement has taken place in Galwan Valley. Even right now, when we are our conversation is on, the top military commanders, the corps commander of the Leh-based Indian Corps and his counterpart are presently in conference, or they were in conference when we started the conversation. So the military dialogue is already on, the diplomatic dialogue is already on. So we got to see where we go from here. And just to go back a little, I do not believe that the road which we are talking about is the positive factor for this incursions by the People's Liberation Army of China. That cannot be possible because the road has been in construction for 19 long years. There was a difficulty of crossing the Shok River, and the bridges are built last year. They were operationalized. Yes, it is no longer the territory of Jammu and Kashmir. It's the state of Ladakh, Union Territory of Ladakh. So that change has happened on 5th August last year. But that is the internal matter of India. Whereas the two, India and China, have long-standing understanding that this is the border question is a legacy left over, historical legacy left over, and we will resolve it. And this difference should not be made into disputes. And this has been going on for many talks, and there are mechanisms in place. The special representative talks have taken place in the month of December, the 22nd round. So the talks are on. We had very robust agreements and established mechanisms for de-escalation and disengagement. They seem to have failed on 15th of June at Galwan. The Indian troops went into a premeditated, pre-planned ambush where the PLA troops did not employ fire. They did not use firearms. But they were armed with spiked clubs, and that is what has changed. And 20 fatal casualties, including a commanding officer, is big. And the Indian public, obviously, there is anger and anguish at this change. This could have handled much better because on 6th of June, the top military commander decided that the disengagement will take place, and PLA troops did not go back.
Einar Tangen, Vinod Bhatia suggested initially that the pandemic, the coronavirus, might have had something to do with China's action. China, of course, criticized globally for its handling of COVID-19. Would you concur that this might be a distraction strategy?
No, I don't think so, at least not on the Chinese side. I mean, if you talk to people here in China, they're actually very proud of their government's response. Initially, they thought it was a little over the top. Some netizens said, what's going on here? But now as they look around the world and they see what China's numbers were, given its population and what's happening in Europe, United States, even in India, they're quite reassured that the government here has done an excellent job of controlling things. Right now, they're concerned about a second wave, but that second wave, which happened in Beijing, happened after these incidents. So I don't think you can draw a line of causality between them. So at this point, I do think there are some efforts by some governments to try to distract from the COVID-19. We've seen that in the United States and other places. And I think it's a bit dangerous playing the nationalist card when you've run out of excuses. But this is human nature. Governments will try to justify their actions. And as I said, what's important now is how do you go forward? I don't know what happened there. I know that an Indian patrol approached the Chinese unit that was there about a tent or something that had been built. Unfortunately, with the military guys, and I'm sure the general can confirm this, there's less writing when they meet and they talk, and you understand that one side is speaking Hindi and the other one is speaking Chinese, and there's plenty of opportunity to not understand each other. If it had been diplomats, they would have written everything down, and it would have been very, very clear. I think perhaps in both sides' minds, they had an understanding that was not complete. So when this commander approached this, Chinese-held position, as usual in a military matter, people did not want to retreat. That's not the nature of a soldier, Indian or Chinese. So at this point, I think we should put that part aside. We should mourn the 20 people who passed away.
But of course, the question, Michael,
senseless violence that it doesn't.
Absolutely, and India is mourning and bemoaning the 20 casualties, of course, it has suffered in the region. The question now, Michael, is how will India react? Will India retaliate in exchange? What options does India really have at this particular point?
Well, I think that India does not want a war with China, or China doesn't want a war with India either. But India, as the weaker of the two countries, militarily speaking, simply does not want to escalate to a point where you have to worry about miscalculation and a war. But even so, setting that aside, I think that if you want to talk about potential retaliations, military retaliations, they're limited options for India for the reasons I mentioned before, as the weaker of the two. I think it's unrealistic to think that there's much that it could do at all, other than perhaps engaging in covert types of retaliation, such as perhaps trying to covertly target Chinese interests in Pakistan, which of course is closely allied with China. But I think that in the immediate term, what you would have to look at in terms of potential responses are economic in nature. There's a lot of anger in India. Popular sentiment is very critical of China. Many calls for India to boycott Chinese goods, and there have been some very popular images that went viral on social media of Indians throwing Chinese-made TVs out of their balcony windows onto the ground. But I think the problem for India, the risk is that if it were to start trying to reduce or even cut its commercial ties with China, that could backfire for India. I mean, India and China have a very significant trade relationship. It's one of the largest in the world by volume. And, India really depends on the Chinese economy a large deal. And I think that it could suffer if it were to try to reduce those ties. And India could also, its intentions of trying to punish China economically may backfire, given that China is such a bigger economy. But I would argue that the ball is essentially in India's court, in the sense that it's stated very emphatically in recent days, its government has, that it's not going to sit quietly. It will give a befitting reply, so to speak. The talk has been tough, even as it's focused on the need for dialogue. So I think that the next move that India makes, if it does make a move, will go a long way toward determining the trajectory of this crisis and whether it de-escalates or not. But again, I would emphasize that India really does have limited options, and certainly limited military options. And at the end of the day, I really do think that India wants to de-escalate and wind things down, which is very different from how it looks at its crises with its other major rival, Pakistan. Pakistan is a weaker state than India. India would be reacting a lot differently, I would assume, if it were to be the situation now with Pakistan as opposed to China.
India has limited military options, says Michael Kugelman, Vinod Bhatia. And Michael is saying India wants to de-escalate at this particular point, which is consistent with the statements made by Prime Minister Modi. He's saying no one has intruded into Indian territory and no Indian post has been occupied. What do you make of his statements?
Coming back to it, war is never an option. War is one of the last resort. So let that be very categorical. And at this point of time, at this stage, neither China nor India can afford a war or wants a war. We have had our differences. I'm not saying that we have our differences. We have a disputed border. And the way nations resolve issues is to sit down and talk. It may take years, it may take long, but that is the way ahead. But this time, India has been hurt. There's anger, there's anguish. China has to realize that we will take losses in the economy. So what? We are not a very rich nation. 550 million youth of India will carry a very bad impression of China as an aggressor. So that is what China should understand. 550 million is a large number. And this is the youth I'm talking about, who are seeing it every day on television screens, social media. We have 1,000 news channels 24/7 talking about this. So look at these young minds. They will go back and say for a lifetime. We are just getting over 62 when there's people who are young in 62 are just about the fag end of their life or they just died, and now you have this happening. So China has to understand that people are very important. Indian people are very important. Fine, if we lose economy, so what? That is okay. But the fact remains that we need to talk and we need to see the way ahead. To that, I have no doubt about it. And that's what Prime Minister Modi's statement is very categorical. And territorial integrity of India, sovereignty of India is non-negotiable. This is something which has to be understood. Well, China is definitely 5 times the economy of India, whatever China be. But the Indian Army, Indian armed forces are also battle-hardened. They're combat-rich. We have our problems. So we have to understand we are deployed along the borders. And we are permanently deployed along the borders. So we have a stance out there. We have our strengths. We may have our weaknesses also, but we have many strengths. And China should get up for that.
And as you said, of course, the public anger in India is growing as far as the call for retaliation is concerned. As a matter of fact, the media, some parts of the Indian media are declaring China the enemy #1. So the media certainly is playing a part in stirring up public anger here as well. Einar Tangen, Chinese-US relations are quite strained, and India-US relations have been quite good. Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi get along quite well. They have good relations. Are you concerned that this incident might spark a US-India alliance in cooperation against China?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it was quite interesting. When this happened, instead of, there was condolences sent about the troops, but there was no support, no voicing of support for the Indian position. And this seems to indicate that Donald Trump is either preoccupied with what he is doing in the U.S., shutting down H-1B visas and things like this and dealing with the pandemic and social unrest. Or he really doesn't care that much about India, except in this regard. Since 2010, the U.S. has made it very clear that they see India as a kind of a doorstop to Chinese expansion. But, the danger here is that this is a repeat of what happened under, the British, under colonial powers, using one Asian nation against another in order to make both weaker and therefore allow them to profit. And it's hopeful that if there is going to, and I believe we're in the midst of an Asian century, it would be better if India and China came together. They're not going to agree on the systems of government, but they can agree that they both want their people to prosper. And I think it would be far better for them to figure out how to be neighbors, since no one's moving, no one's going anywhere, than it is to do the bidding of a colonial power intent on weakening both nations.
Michael, obviously, all three of you are in agreement that de-escalation is necessary at this particular point. No one has an interest in a prolonged armed conflict here. What's next? What are concrete steps to solve this crisis?
Well, I think that you need this dialogue that began earlier in June to continue. And I think it's encouraging that right after that very violent clash last Monday, that right away the two sides started talking. And, it's notable that there have been a number of these border spats in recent years. And each time there's been one, the two sides are essentially able to work things out on their own without any type of external mediation. And that's sort of another question that's come to mind. Should there be some sort of player? And Russia has been thrown out there as an option, a player that should be intervening to mediate, given that the situation has gotten more tense. This standoff has been more tense than recent ones have been. But typically the Indians and the Chinese are able to work things out on their own. And I think it's very encouraging that they are using this dialogue, that they are talking. But of course, the issue is that since tensions are higher now between the two than they've been in a number of years, I think it's going to be hard to expect either side to want to make concessions and make compromises. So that means that India probably will not really have any interest in reducing these road building projects that China would like it to stop. And, we don't know exactly the story with Chinese positions. There is reason to believe that you may still have cases of of PLA forces on what India believes to be its side. India would want them out of there. China, I think, is not going to necessarily relent. So it's good that you have a dialogue going, but it would be easy, unfortunately, for that dialogue not to be successful. And if the two sides conclude that talks aren't working, that's when I think you have to worry about, you have to look back to the battlefield, so to speak, and see what might happen along the line of actual control. And that's when you'd have to worry about potential escalation. But so long as they're talking, I think that's a good thing. So long as the rhetoric from the government sides is relatively conciliatory, which it is, I think that's a good sign. But if either of those things change, if they stop talking,
right,
and the government rhetoric on both sides becomes more confrontational or bellicose.
So as long as the talks are continuing, we're in the clear. Vinod Bhatia, Einar Tangen, Michael Kugelman, thank you so much for your insights. And this wraps up a new edition of Newsmakers. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.